Thank you for coming tonight. My name is Jennifer Bestie, and I hold the College of St. Benedict Coach Chair in Catholic Thought and Culture. And I want to welcome you to the annual College of St. Benedict Coach Chair Lecture. This year it is entitled The Global Common Good in a World of Rising Nationalism. On behalf of the College of St. Benedict, I wish to express tremendous gratitude to Barbara and David Koch, who established the Coach Chair. Celebrating the Catholic, Benedictine, and liberal arts mission of our college, the Coach Chair offers courses and provides programming that enables faculty, students, and the wider community to explore contemporary issues related to Catholic faith and culture. I also wish to thank Jen Schwichtenberg, my assistant, for organizing all of the details concerning tonight's lecture. I am very grateful to the School of Theology, the Departments of Hispanic Studies, History, Political Science, Sociology, and Theology, the IISS, the LLAS, and the McCarthy Center for co-sponsoring tonight's program. It is now a privilege for me to introduce the Reverend David Hollenbach, who is a Jesuit priest and a distinguished Catholic moral theologian. Dr. Hollenbach is Pedro Arrupe Professor in the Walsh School of Foreign Service and Senior Fellow of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. He works on human rights and humanitarian issues, largely in Africa, teaching regularly at Hekima University College in Nairobi, Kenya. Dr. Hollenbach collaborates with the Jesuit Refugee Service on the human rights of displaced persons internationally. He has conducted workshops for parliamentarians and church leaders in South Sudan on human rights. Dr. Hollenbach has written hundreds of articles and is the author or editor of 10 books, including The Common Good and Christian Ethics, The Global Face of Public Faith, Refugee Rights, Driven from Home, Protecting the Rights of Forced Migrants. He has received many awards, including the John Courtney Murray Award for outstanding contributions to theology from the Catholic Theological Society of America. His new book, Humanity in Crisis, Ethical and Religious Responses to Refugees, has just been published a few weeks ago, and it's available for sale in the back thanks to our CSB bookstore. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Hollenbach to our campus.
I am very grateful to have been invited to present the Coach Lecture here at St. Benedict's College this evening. And I'm particularly grateful to Jennifer Bestie for having invited me. It's a real honor for me to be here with you tonight, and it's a delight to see so many people here to talk about an issue that is very dear to my own heart. So thank you for being here. My comments this evening will sketch an element of the impact of rising nationalism on the global common good. In doing this, I'm going to outline some of the elements of my current effort to develop an ethical and religious perspective on how we ought to respond to the massive movement of displaced people in our time, particularly those who have been driven from their homes as refugees. Refugees are people who have fallen through the cracks of our global system, people who are excluded from the common good, both of their home country, but also the common good of the human community as a whole. In this reality is a very challenging one because it points to the way in which the rising nationalism, which wants to say we count but those others do not count, are really raising very serious challenges for our adequate response to the needs of people who have been displaced from their homes. Now, migration and the movement of refugees has, of course, been occurring throughout human history. Especially, it's been occurring since the first early humans left Eastern Africa to move to Arabia and eventually to the rest of the world, starting some 60,000 years ago. People have always been on the move in an effort to improve their lives or to escape war, oppression, famine, and other threats to their well-being. In very recent decades, however, migration has been dramatically increasing, especially the forced migration of refugees and internally displaced people. Now, almost all of us here, except the possibly few indigenous Native Americans among us, all of us, except those Native Americans, arrived in the United States, our families did, as migrants. And many of our family ancestors came to this country as refugees, fleeing persecution because of their religion, or because of their political views, or for some other reason. So as we reflect this evening on the common good of our global human community and the effect of rising nationalism on the displaced people of our day, I think it's important for us to remember our history, where we came from. My father's family were migrants to the United States way back 200 years ago because they were being persecuted for their religious belief in Prussia. There are plenty of Irish Catholics who came to this country because they were facing the effects of the famine in Ireland, a famine caused, I regret to say, by some of the actions of the English government. So many of us have come here just as refugees and forced migrants have come more recently to our country. Now today, many of today's displaced people are fleeing conflicts in places like Syria, South Sudan, the Northern Triangle of Central America, the countries like El Salvador and Guatemala and so forth. Last year, however, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees reported that the number of people displaced in our world today by war, strife, and serious human rights violations had reached 70.8 million people. That report from last June is 13.6 million people more than just 1 year earlier. The 70+ million forced migrants of our world today is the highest number ever recorded by the High Commissioner for Refugees. And the number of deaths from conflict and disasters in many parts of the world remains distressingly high. In the past decade, for example, in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo in Central Africa, over 5 million persons have died due to the conflict in that region. Thus, the protection of people's right to share in the common good of the human community as a whole, from severe threats to their humanity, unfortunately remains a very distant goal. Now, a refugee is a specific kind of migrant. The 1951 United Nations Refugee Convention defines a refugee as a person who, quote, because of a well-founded fear of being persecuted, has been driven out of his or her own country and has crossed an international border. The persecution refugees face means that their basic human rights are on the line. The phrase forced migrants has been coined recently to take account of the fact that not only persecution, but also extreme poverty or environmental changes are increasingly driving people from their homes. In addition, people can be forced from home while remaining inside their own country, and therefore not being counted as refugees, but becoming called internally displaced persons. That adds up to 70.8 million forcibly displaced people in our world. Why is all of this happening? Why this dramatic increase in the number of people forced from their home? War is the chief cause, although increasingly environmental change and other forms of extreme poverty are rising in their impact on this as well. But today, at least for now, war is the chief cause. But why so much war? It's not interstate conflict, but intra-state conflict that is the main source of it. Why this kind of conflict and the expansion of it? The journal Foreign Affairs, probably the most distinguished journal accounting for dealing with international politics in our country today, recently described the problem bluntly when it titled one of its recent issues, "Out of Order." The phrase referring to the international system being in a state of disarray or a state of being out of order. The global common good of our international order is being undermined by the rise of populist nationalisms that have led to phenomena such as Brexit in the United Kingdom, or to President Trump's desire to say America first should shape the foreign policy of the United States. The Trump administration has recently announced that it will reduce the number of refugees who will be resettled in the United States this year to 18,000, down from about 100 and a few plus at the end of the Obama administration. This is the lowest level of refugee admission since we have been counting the numbers in the United States. In the face of the more than 70 million forcibly displaced people of our world today, the reduction from 33,000 last year to 18,000 this year is an almost insignificant number, although it makes a big difference to the number of people who are not going to be admitted. But we're not going to solve the 70 million forcibly displaced people by pushing the number back up to 30,000 from 18 next year. But the reduction, despite the fact that it's relatively small compared to the vast need that exists, remains extremely important because it is a symbolic indicator of the direction in which the United States seems to want to go these days. This reduction, if it takes place, as it looks like it is going to, means that the United States, the so-called nation of immigrants, will no longer be the top-ranking country in refugee admission in the world. Up until this year, the United States has been the most open to the receiving of refugees of any country in the world. If we move to 18,000, we will no longer hold that position. That's a symbolic change of significant importance. And it's a symbolic change that could have considerable practical effect. For example, that kind of reduction means that the US government will dramatically reduce the support that it provides for the 9 major agencies that do all the work of resettling refugees in this country, including the Catholic Bishops' Agency called Migration and Refugee Services. The 9 agencies that do all of the refugee resettlement in the United States, 6 of them are faith-based, religious-based, and one of the biggest is Migration and Refugee Services, run by the Catholic Church. This decline of support for those agencies puts them in real danger of being forced out of business altogether. There are some who suggest that the goal of the dramatic reduction in the number of refugees is not only to exclude the refugees, but to put these agencies out of business. And once you do that, it's very difficult to start them up again. Despite my comments on the problems in the UK with Brexit, or the United States with America First, or with some of the other phenomena that are going on in Europe, for example, the Alternative for Deutschland party in Germany, or Viktor Orban's party in Hungary, who wanted to be very exclusionary toward refugees, the problem also exists in the Southern Hemisphere. Zayed Rad al-Hussein, the Jordanian prince who until just this past year was the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, put it bluntly about the problems in the Southern Hemisphere. In his words, he said, quote, "We find ourselves in a political earthquake zone. Unprecedented numbers of people are fleeing their homes. Yet rather than dealing with them, we seem to be turning away and looking inwards," end quote. Nations and peoples are turning inward in many parts of the world, looking away from the common good we share across borders and just looking toward the well-being of themselves and their own countries. The displacement of people as refugees and the inadequate response to their needs brought by this turning inwards are vivid signs of what Foreign Affairs calls the out-of-order nature of our international system. Now, there are several causes for this nationalistic turning inwards. Some see it as due to a kind of cultural backlash against people with unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar lifestyles, or religions that are different from one's own, that are being brought by immigrants and refugees into our countries. Others see it as a response to the economic forces of globalization and the growing inequality that is present in our societies. The inequality of our country is one of the main reasons that many working people have come to resent immigrants who they believe might take their jobs, and whom they think their taxes are in some way subsidizing. As I will note later, however, such fear is often misplaced when directed toward refugees, for most refugees actually contribute more to our country than they take from it. Nevertheless, it is certainly true that sizable numbers of people in our country and in some European countries feel threatened by migration and refugees. Thus, we need to adopt an approach in responding to the needs of refugees that not only responds to the needs of the refugees, we also need to address the vulnerability that many working people feel that leads them to support politics that resists the reception of displaced people. So, what are our responsibilities in the face of the suffering of the millions of displaced people in our world today? As the number of displaced people has risen, some philosophers and refugee scholars have argued that the time may have come to consider making borders fully open to migration and to granting asylum to all who are fleeing from persecution, conflict, and disaster. I'm not going to adopt that position, but I just want to lay out some reasons why one might adopt it. Support for such an approach can be given Christian religious backing. For example, in the Gospel of Matthew, just after Jesus' birth, he was driven from home with Mary and Joseph by King Herod's effort to destroy him as a threat to Herod's regime. Being somewhat anachronistic, we could therefore say that since Jesus was fleeing persecution across an international border, he met the contemporary International Refugee Convention's definition of a refugee. Jesus was a refugee. Also in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus teaches that on the day of judgment, one's salvation will be determined by whether one has welcomed the hungry, the thirsty, and most relevant to this situation, the stranger. Thus, Christians should recognize their special duties toward the suffering people who are not members of their own communities, including migrants and refugees. Jesus' inclusive teaching toward the stranger echo the book of Genesis affirmation that all persons have been created in the image of God and are thus brothers and sisters in a single human family, no matter what their nationality or ethnicity or religion. The universality of human dignity led Pope John the 23rd, back in his encyclical Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, issued in 1963, led him to say, quote, "The fact that one is a citizen of a particular state does not detract in any way from his membership in the human family as a whole, nor from his citizenship in the world community." John the 23rd applied this concept of world citizenship, especially to refugees, and he called for extending welcome to those forcibly displaced from their homes. Now, this philosophical and Christian universalism cannot mean, however, that state borders have no significance. Why? I think it's because respect for the common humanity of all people not only supports our call to recognize that we are all humans together, but it also requires us to respect the differences that exist among us. Respect for people means respecting not only their similarity to me, but also respecting the fact that they can be different than I am. An exclusive emphasis on what we have in common would have difficulty explaining why being forced from home has such negative moral significance. If just being part of the universal human community is the only thing that counts, being driven to another country shouldn't make any difference. But it does. It's because being connected to people nearby means something. Not only good philosophy, therefore, but good Christian values call for both universal respect for all persons and also for respect for their distinctive identities. The common good we share, therefore, has multiple dimensions because we are members of many communities on different levels. Some of our communal relationships are intimate with people very nearby, such as our spouse or our family members or our neighborhoods or our cities. Other of the common communities that we're members of are larger and more distant, such as our relationship to the citizens of our own country, and also our relations with our fellow human beings in the global human family. There is a shared good, a common good, therefore, that we attain on each of these different levels of community. The notion of the common good is therefore multiple. There are many common goods, all connected to each other. Now, seeing the common good as the good we share in our relationships is particularly relevant, I think, to the tensions between today's rising nationalism and the needs of displaced people. A relational understanding of the common good can see the common good as similar to the good of friendship. In friendship, people enjoy a good they cannot enjoy alone. Being friends with someone means I'm with them, and the friendship is something between us, something we share. It's not something that can be divided up and taken home by oneself. If you do it by yourself, it isn't friendship anymore. So the relationship between people is crucial. Similarly, there are aspects of the common good that exist in the bonds between people in different kinds of community. And enhancing the common good, therefore, means enhancing and supporting the relationships that enable people to be bonded together. We can call the relationships that bind people together in friendship or in other kinds of relatedness in mutually supportive ways, we can call those bonds solidarity. Such solidarity or friendship binds people together as a we, and that leads them to see the good of the we as their own good. It's not my good, it's our good. That's what makes it a common good. Now, millennia ago, Aristotle wrote that such friendships seem to hold states together. That if you don't have some kind of solidarity with your fellow citizens, the state itself won't hold together. So we need that kind of bondedness with our fellow citizens to keep our country together. But we could extend this and say that there is a kind of solidarity and a kind of friendship that's needed to hold not only states, but families, cities, and even the global human community together. These diverse forms of solidarity lead members of different kinds of community to recognize that their well-being is shared. The very relationships linking them with other members of the we are key aspects of the common good they share. These bonds of solidarity, of course, range from the most intimate to the truly global. Those with whom we have special relations, such as our family or our fellow citizens, deserve distinctive forms of treatment as an expression of our friendship with them or our love for them. Christian love, therefore, requires both universal respect for all our neighbors and also genuine respect and support for our family members, our co-citizens, and so forth. Christian ethics, therefore, affirms that one has duties both to those nearby and to those who are strangers, such as migrants and refugees. Neither the local nor the global can be seen as absolute. The challenge then is to find an appropriate way to relate these diverse forms of solidarity to each other. St. Augustine and St. Thomas Aquinas both recognize that we need to determine what they call an order of priorities among our diverse communities and our many forms of relationship. They called this an ordo amoris in Latin, an order of our loves, a way of ordering our diverse friendships, our diverse loves, our diverse relationships to each other. Loves for our family, for our fellow citizens, and for the global community. How to relate these different forms of relationship to each other becomes crucial. we will need to build up the common good of each of these multiple communities that shape our lives, all at the same time. And that's where the big challenge comes, it seems to me. The mass displacement of millions of people in our world calls us to reflect carefully on the relative weights of the obligations we have to these different kinds of community. And so let me suggest several priorities, an order of loves, an ordo amoris, that can help us discover how to relate these different duties to each other as we face the refugee question today. At the top of the list of priorities, I would suggest, that should shape our response to the refugee crisis are some very binding negative duties not to act in ways that cause refugee displacement. These negative duties include the duty not to persecute or oppress people and the obligation not to commit acts of war such as aggression or indiscriminate attacks on civilians. Since these are among the chief causes of refugee displacement, the duty not to do that is a key priority in responding to the refugee crisis. All of us have a duty, and all of our countries have duties, not to commit grave abuses like genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, which drive so many from their homes by treating them as if they were not human at all. That priority is relevant because if we could stop these offenses, genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, we could make real progress on reducing the massive displacements of our time, since most people are displaced by precisely such kinds of violations. But in addition to those negative duties, there are also positive duties toward displaced people from their people displaced both from their own countries as refugees or within their countries as internally displaced people. We can clarify when we have such positive duties by drawing on a form of moral analysis originally developed by several scholars at Yale University several decades ago, when they were reflecting on the obligation of Yale University to take action in terms of its investments regarding the apartheid regime in South Africa. They came up with something they called the Kew Gardens principle, for their reflection arose from their thinking about a tragic event that occurred in the Kew Gardens section of New York City. This is a fairly well-known case which they drew upon. A case when a young woman named Kitty Genovese was walking home from work at night. She was assaulted, knifed, and died a slow death, while 38 nearby people watched and did nothing, not even calling the police. Now, the report on exactly what happened that was in the New York Times that produced a huge outrage was somewhat inaccurate, it turns out. But the fact that so many people became outraged when they read that 38 people did nothing to save this woman's life, some of them right at telephones when they could have called the police and didn't do anything. Many people were so outraged, it pointed to the fact that most people believe that omission of acts that can really help people in grave need can be harmful, not only acts of commission. So not only the person who did the terrible murder could be held responsible, but some of those who did nothing to stop it could be held responsible as well. Drawing on this conviction, these scholars at Yale reached the conclusion that there can be a positive responsibility to take action to help alleviate crisis situations, even when one has not caused those crisis situations oneself. When, quote, there is a grave need, when one has proximity to the need, like those 38 people who were right next door to the woman being knifed, when one has the capability to do something about it, and when the response by others is unlikely. When to that was further added a criterion where taking action could be done without disproportionate burden to oneself. If one could pick up the telephone without becoming harmed in any way, one has an obligation to do so. Now, using those criteria, I think we can reflect on our responsibilities toward the people being displaced from their homes today. The large number of people being displaced from Syria, South Sudan, the Northern Triangle of Central America, the Rohingya being driven from their homes in Myanmar, and many others are certainly in grave need of protection. They are in flight precisely because of threats to their basic human rights, and in many cases, they are in flight because of threats to their very lives. The duty to respond falls first on those with proximity to the people who are in need, because proximity to a crisis puts one in a position to know more about it, and in many cases, to know better how to respond to it. This means that the government of a nation where a crisis is occurring and the local communities within that nation bear the prime responsibility for responding to the crisis. For example, in El Salvador, both the government of El Salvador and the violent gangs that are causing such threats to so many people in El Salvador have a positive duty to lift the burdens facing the people being displaced from that country and seeking to come across our border. But the duty to take positive action does not stop at the national borders of the countries where the crisis is present. When people become aware of the crisis, people in another country become aware of it, even at a great distance, this leads to what might be called moral proximity. Proximity through awareness, awareness of those who are suffering. An example of that would be the helpful, although imperfect, response by the countries that are surrounding South Sudan today. South Sudan, a country where in a civil war has displaced a full 2 million people by the conflict. The regional organization of South Sudan's neighboring countries is called the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, I-G-A-D for short. These are the countries like Kenya, Uganda, Ethiopia, Somalia, the countries immediately surrounding South Sudan. They have this agency called IGAD that has tried to take made diplomatic efforts to try to bring the conflict in South Sudan to a conclusion. They've been playing this role actually since well before South Sudan even became an independent country, going back to the internal civil war that existed in Sudan between the northern part of the country and the southern part that eventually led to a peace agreement that brought about an agreement that led finally to the independence of the southern part of the country as the new country of South Sudan. But this IGAD group, along with other groups that joined with them in something called IGAD Plus, of which the United States became a member, took serious efforts to bring about an end to the civil war in South Sudan. And they have been playing a role in trying to bring the current civil war, they helped bring the civil war in Sudan before South Sudan became independent to a conclusion, and they have been working at bringing the civil war in South Sudan to an end. This has not settled the issue, but a real contribution has been made by IGAD and IGAD Plus, and it shows that countries at a distance can take positive action to alleviate a crisis and help overcome some of the causes of mass displacement. A sense of the moral responsibility arose in these more distant countries, like the surrounding countries, and then the United States and Norway and several others that became affiliated with it because of their proximity through awareness. The mediation has not been perfect, but it has made a real difference, and therefore it has been a genuine contribution. So that's the criterion of proximity. The criterion of capability also sheds light on the positive duties we have across borders toward displaced people. Capability is relevant because I think we would all agree that someone who cannot swim does not have a duty to come to the aid of a child who is drowning, whereas a good swimmer can have a duty. The capability to swim is relevant to whether there's a duty to respond to a drowning child. We don't want 2 drownings instead of just 1, so the non-swimmer doesn't have a duty to come to the aid of a child in great danger. That's relevant in helping us think about the countries that are facing refugee crisis, facing the displacement of so many people into their own countries today. For example, Syria's proximate neighbors, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan, are already massively overburdened by Syrian refugees. A country like Lebanon or Jordan does not possess the economic and other capability to provide asylum for many more Syrian refugees. On the other hand, the resources of the wealthy nations of Western Europe, the United States, and the Gulf states have the capacity to receive many more asylum seekers than they are currently receiving. For example, today in Lebanon, 1 out of every 6 people inside the boundaries of the country of Lebanon is a refugee. 1 out of 6. If we talked about that in the United States, we'd be talking about pushing toward 100 million people, or maybe not, 50 million people. We're not even close to that kind of refugee presence in this country. So the burden on a country like Lebanon for the Syrian refugees that are there is vastly greater, even than the burden that was placed on Germany when Angela Merkel admitted 1 million in 2015-16. So the burdens are much greater and disproportionate in various parts of the world. Responsibility to deal with the needs of refugees is in some sense proportional to the capability of doing so. The responsibilities that we have these responsibilities can be carried out by granting asylum to more refugees, or by providing larger opportunities for resettlement for refugees, and perhaps most importantly, by providing economic and other forms of assistance to the countries that are already hosting the vast majority of the world's refugees. Approximately 85% of all the refugees in the world are in developing countries. And 1/3 of the refugees of the world are in the 10 poorest countries of the world. So the economic burden is radically disproportionate. When Angela Merkel admitted 1 million Syrian refugees to Germany back several years ago, an effort was made to find a way to redistribute those Syrian refugees to other parts of Europe. And the then Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, who was David Cameron at that time, made an announcement that the United Kingdom would do its duty. It would admit 20,000 Syrian refugees over the next 5 years. The Interior Minister of Lebanon said, "I'm very grateful to hear that from Prime Minister Cameron, but I would like to inform him that Lebanon admitted that many Syrian refugees over the last 2 weekends, not over the last 5 years." It's a pointing to the disproportionate burden being carried by different parts of the world in responding to the needs of refugees. And we need, therefore, it seems to me, to recognize that if responsibility is in some sense proportionate to capability, we in the United States, those in Europe, and those in the Gulf states, those rich, oil-rich countries of the Gulf, have a major responsibility that they're not living up to in proportion to their capability of doing so. We're not close to carrying the burden that a country like Uganda is carrying. Uganda has 1.5 million South Sudanese inside its border today. And Uganda is an extremely poor country. Finding ways to assist Uganda in facing that is a very big challenge. So this is a way of pointing to the fact that I think we need to think about priorities in how we deal about refugees and the way they're responded to by our country. What I'm trying to suggest is, for sure, we have a duty to protect our own citizens. But that's not an absolute duty. We also have a duty to our fellow humans whose lives are in danger and whose very well-being is on the line. We have a responsibility to do so, partly because the need is so great, partially because we're aware of it through proximity of awareness, and partly because we're capable of making a difference. Those things, it seems to me, all point toward responsibilities that don't mean to say that I'm advocating open borders. They do mean to say that I think our borders are not so absolute that we can stand by and let people die like Kitty Genovese died in the Kew Gardens section of New York. Now, one last point, and that is that solid evidence points to the fact that admitting refugees does not usually place significant burdens on the home country that admits them. In the United States, for example, the median income of refugees is the same as the median income of those born in this country, which means they pay just as much taxes as most Americans do. Indeed, they pay more taxes than the richest Americans do. Also, the statistics indicate that refugees have a higher employment rate than do US-born persons. Most refugees come here with a fairly good education already and come here with a high motivation to make their lives better, and therefore they work hard. They're more likely to be working than people who are born in the US who may be relying on social services to support them. Refugees, on average, have higher skill levels than do those born in the United States. If you want this data, you can find it easily if you go to the Center for Migration Studies in New York. They've got a very interesting report on all of these resources. But it points to the fact that the fear that some working class Americans have that refugees are going to come in here and take a lot of money away from the system that belongs to supporting them, it's the opposite way around. These refugees may actually contribute more to building up the communities that are coming, that they're coming into. In light of these transnational duties to the common good, therefore, the refugee crisis that is occurring today seems to me to call us to new action in the United States. It calls us to reassess the nearly absolute value that we place on state sovereignty and national borders. Our responsibility to help refugees and displaced people is proportionate both to our proximity to those in need, but more importantly today, to our capacity to assist them effectively. North America, Western Europe, and the Gulf states all have urgent duties to share the burden with the very poor countries who are already helping most of the refugees of today's world. Distributing these responsibilities in a fair and politically effective way is urgently required today. Such solidarity is required by the global common good, by the good we share together as human beings when the lives of others are at stake. And it is called for by the very humanity that we share with the displaced. Thank you.
David, thank you very much for all of your thought-provoking insights. And David has graciously agreed to have a spirited question and answer session. So please, I encourage students first to please come to the mics, and then others, of course, as well. But what are the questions, what are the real questions that David's talk has brought up? So he's really great with question and answers. It's always my favorite part when I watch Father Hollenbach. So please come up and ask some good questions.
Okay, good. We've got one coming up. Please, right ahead. Go right ahead.
How you doing?
Fine, thank you.
My name is Len Gurton. I'm a senior here, theology major.
That's great.
I just have a quick question in regards to, I just kind of want to play devil's advocate.
Go right
as
ahead.
Having a brother from Rwanda and seeing the success in his, I guess, refugee story, just taking that into mind, but also, again, playing devil's advocate. How are we to take care of large amounts of immigrants when we have Americans suffering in our own backyards? In terms, and you talked about the economic value of refugees, and I appreciate that. I'm going to look up those statistics when I get home. But I mean, it's something to acknowledge to take in so many people when our standard of living really hasn't improved in decades, and we have people who are working for $9.25, aren't getting proper health insurance, and these are our neighbors, and we're to now welcome in more people into a system that just isn't being fixed.
Well, I mean, the question then becomes, would admitting more refugees take money away from the people in this country that we're trying to assist? And the answer, I think, is, especially if you look at the overall impact in aggregate, the answer is no. It will not detract from the ability to assist those in this country who are in need. It may actually contribute to providing more resources, because if my data, I'm bringing this data forward from very well-established sources, that the refugees actually contribute more in the taxes they pay than they take out from social services. And they may also generate, they take a job, but their work also generates jobs. Now, there may be some shifting around of where the jobs are and so forth, and that's a very important issue and needs to be examined. But my argument would be, it's not a threat overall to the economic resources that we have to deal with the poor in this country. In fact, admitting more refugees might be able to increase the situation, the tax resources available for assisting those who are more poor, if you're going to use a tax and transfer arrangement for dealing with that kind of thing. So I think the question would be, is the admission of refugees really a threat to the people that you're talking about? My argument would be, if you look at the data, the answer is no. And that's where I would want to argue that we need not to let ourselves get trapped into the false idea that these people are a threat to our well-being. What's happened is a number of people in this country who are in the working class and the lower economic levels fear that income of refugees is going to threaten their well-being. In fact, it may go the other way around. If you look at the data, that would help. That would be a way of trying to respond to your question. Now, you can say my facts are wrong, and if you want to say that, you can produce some other facts, but that would be my argument to respond to your concern. I hope that makes some sense to you.
Yes, Father, thank you very much, appreciate it.
Okay, others, please. More questions and observations. I welcome your criticisms as well. I'm not just here to answer questions but if you want to raise an objection to what I say, please do. Yeah.
Hi, good evening, Father. I have a question related to the Peace and Social Justice Center with Sister Uris on this. Historically speaking, we've had people like the Berrigan brothers, sisters who've tied themselves to fences, protested against the war, various wars from the Vietnam War. And on the other hand, we've actually had the Catholic Church supporting fascist dictatorships in parts of the world that have created these displaced people. We've had your school here, the Wells School of International Studies, its graduates have gone on to work for the CIA, and the graduates from have gone out to not only be part of the military-industrial complex, but actually have created some of these policies that have created some of the situations that to begin with. I mean, I'm a little confused about the Jesuits. On one hand, we have the Berrigan brothers who were Jesuits for peace and social justice. On the other hand, we have people like Carol Quigley, and your institute has produced and contracted for the military-industrial complex. So I'm a little confused here when you're dealing with the Catholic Church. On one hand, is half of it's as Sister says, it's a big family, but a rather dysfunctional family. On one hand, we have one that's social justice. On the other hand, we've had the Catholic Church side with dictatorships and fascists and creating even problems such as Christians and Muslims fighting in the Middle East. Thank you.
That's a big question, and it would take me about a long time to answer all the details of it. I would simply suggest this, that the Catholic community is, as you say, a very complex and multi-dimensional community, a big tent, as you would say. I don't think it's fair to say that the Catholic Church has supported military dictatorships in any kind of official way. There may have been some people, like you mentioned, particular person by name, Carol Quigley, who may have a certain inclination in that direction. He wasn't a Jesuit, he taught at Georgetown, but he wasn't a Jesuit. But if you look at the statistics since the Second Vatican Council, the Second Vatican Council made some major breakthroughs in the commitment of the Catholic Church in the world to human rights. The breakthrough of the Declaration on Religious Freedom at Vatican II, which was approved in 1965, followed up just by 2 years, the encyclical of Pope John the 23rd, Peace on Earth, which is a human rights charter. Very strong commitment to human rights, strong commitment to accountability and not support for military dictatorships. The distinguished international relations scholar, the late Samuel Huntington, who was not so much to the left himself, he was a strong cold warrior, but he did a major study of the rise of democracy over the last several decades. And he had a theory that he called the 3 waves of democracy. He wrote a book called The Third Wave about what was going on in the contemporary period in the 1990s and early 2000s about support for democracy. And he said the first wave of democratization in the world was the wave that began with the French and American revolutions. The second wave of democratization globally was right after World War II, when the Axis powers, Germany, Italy, Japan, moved from dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, to democracy. The third wave of democratization, according to Huntington, began in 1965 and continued into the 1990s. And he argued that more than 2/3 of the countries that moved from dictatorship to democracy from 1965 to the early mid-90s were Catholic countries, countries with strong Catholic traditions. Latin America, places like Chile, Brazil, Argentina, places like the Philippines that moved from Ferdinand Marcos's dictatorship to democracy, places like South Korea that moved from a military dictatorship to a democracy, Poland, and the beginning, and what happened in Eastern Europe, which was could be attributed to the actions of Pope John Paul II and his interventions in Poland, which was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union. So Huntington said, what happened at the Second Vatican Council that committed the Catholic Church to human rights and religious freedom was the beginning of the massive movement toward democracy around the world in places except in the Confucian and Islamic societies of China and parts of the Islamic world. The question for him then was, does the Confucian tradition and Islamic tradition have the capacity to move toward human rights and democratization the way Catholicism has? He was less optimistic. I'm a little more optimistic about what's going on in the Muslim world. There's a very interesting book by a man named Dan Philpott that was published just about 6 months ago on religious freedom in the Islamic world that shows that there's a significant movement toward more human rights and democracy in the Islamic world right now than we normally recognize. But my long-winded comment is basically to say, I don't agree with your supposition that Catholicism supports military dictatorship. It may have at certain points, never officially, I don't think, but I also think that since the Second Vatican Council, there has been a very deep commitment toward democracy and human rights, and that this applies not only to Catholic countries, but to advocating for advancement of democracy globally coming out of Catholicism. So that's in the background of my emphasis on the human rights of refugees. So hope that responds to your concern. Other questions or observations you want to call it?
We have time for one question from an old person.
I know that Pope Francis has a strong voice in advocating for immigrants, but that message does not seem to be translating to the people in the pews. How can we get bishops and parish priests to get on board with this?
Well, the United States bishops are very much on board with this. I think you could probably say that the single strongest voice on behalf of refugees in the world today is the voice of Pope Francis. He's very strong on this issue. He went off to the island of Lesbos, where there were huge numbers of Syrian refugees, visited them. Not only did he come and give a talk to them and say how much he supported them, he took 2 Muslim refugee families with him in his plane back to the Vatican and has been providing them a home there. He didn't ask the Italian government whether he could do it or not, he just did it. And he took them there, and so he's been very supportive. You're right, though, that there is a problem with regard to where attitudes are in the pew. It's a mixed picture in the pew in the United States. white Catholics are less likely to be supportive of refugees than Latino Catholics. Not surprisingly, because Latino Catholics know that their brothers and sisters are here because of migration and because of some of them fleeing refugee situations in parts of Latin America and so forth. One of the questions that I have, and I'm writing an article about this right now, is I would like to know the class breakdown of white Catholic attitudes. I have a feeling, this is a hunch, it could be wrong, but it's a hunch, that upper middle class white Catholics are more supportive of refugees and migrants than working class and poorer white Catholics are. Partly because the working class and poorer white Catholics fear the impact of migration and refugees on their own well-being. My view is that they don't have that fear. They shouldn't be afraid in that way, given the statistics that I've already tried to cite. But their attitudes are being manipulated for political purposes by our current government, who thinks that they can get white voters by making them fear migrants and refugees. Now that's it's a complicated picture, but I'd like to get more data to find out what the breakdown between the economic levels of white Catholics would be. Latino Catholics are probably the single strongest group in favor of support for migration and refugees of any group in the country. That's probably coming because they're Latinos, not so much because they're Catholics, who knows? But I'd like to know where the Catholic values fit in by a class analysis about incomes and levels of education among white Catholics to see what really, if it's because of class differences, then the solution has to address the class problem. You can't solve the problem by just saying, well, we're going to talk louder. We have to find ways to address the problems that making people fear migrants. And that's a question, it seems to me, of moving toward addressing the reasons why so many working class white people are fearful that jobs are going to be lost and taxes are going to be used for purposes that don't benefit them and so forth. Those kinds of things need to be addressed, and I hope that we can do that and help the church move forward on this. So thanks. Good question.
Thank you very much for coming, and please keep in mind that you can, there are David's books available for purchase in the back.